So thank you again. I, I love that you did a land acknowledgement, Karen. I don't often come to industry conferences where there's a land acknowledgement. But I too would like to recognize that we are on traditional Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I want also to acknowledge the people who clean this building, who clean the floors, who clean the bathrooms, the people who grew the beans to make our coffee, the people at the hotel who are cleaning the rooms there, the volunteers here. It's like such important labor, and it doesn't get recognized often enough. So I wanted to thank you for that. And finally, of course, I want to thank London and Fanshawe College for having this event. I think that we don't get to do this kind of like cross-pollinating interdisciplinary stuff often enough. And it's just really cool to be having an event like this here in London. And to be here at a time when there's like just so much change happening here. I've been hearing a lot about London. I'm from Toronto, but I've been hearing a lot about the growth in London's creative industry and creative professional world. And it's just so cool to be here at a time when you're defining yourselves and when your creative energy is so fresh and so palpable and so untainted by everything like Toronto is. So today I want to share with you some of what I've learned in my practice, and I'm really excited also to learn from all of you. So let's get started. There we go. So a bit of a content warning. I'm going to be talking about violence. I'm going to be talking about sexism. I'm going to be talking about racism. There is a mild amount of nudity. So just, I don't know, hold on to your seats. We're going to get through it. But I'm also going to be talking about how we respond to these kinds of things, and how we respond to like the bad kind of nudity, not the good kind of nudity. I'll talk about that in a moment. So as Karen mentioned, my focus is design for social justice, a collaborative design for social justice. So I'm trained as a graphic designer, and I've been doing this for about 15 years. And I went to design school with the intention of practicing design for social justice, even though I had no idea what that meant at the time, and I'm still figuring it out. But I've worked on campaigns, I've worked on reports, I've worked on tech tools that are all about serving the needs of communities that are facing injustice. And more recently, I've been trying to do this in really collaborative ways, so working with and within communities to develop solutions that are really going to work for them, that are driven by their own needs and their own experiences. But today, I'm mainly here to talk to you about the future. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, so I'm going to apologize. I'm going to show a bunch of Star Trek stills because I can. And also because this Star Trek The Next Generation was the future of my past. And this is, to me, when I was a kid growing up, this is what I imagined the future to be like. And I want to kind of put us in that mindset, like, what did the future of the past look like? People who came before us, what kinds of futures were they imagining? And then what kind of impact did that have? So I think about the future a lot. And I think we all do, because as creatives, that's our job, right? We're shaping the future on a daily basis. And if you think about it, the pixels and the words that are on our screens today, those become the ideas and the images and the objects of tomorrow. So everything that we do has an impact, and we need to really be aware of that. So as creatives, our stories are about current problems that are being solved in the future by solutions that we're working on today. So take, for example, the problem of like blurry photos. You've taken a group photo, it's kind of blurry, or like some jerk has blinked. So what if there was a camera? We ask questions like, what if there was a camera that could address these issues? Like, what if there was a camera that could automatically detect the faces of people in the photo, and that could give you a heads up that somebody blinked so you can try again? Like, what an amazing future that would be, right? And the future is here for some people, right? Like, I don't think that the engineers and designers of this camera were like, hey, let's not test this with any Asians, just because, right? And I also don't think they thought, like, let's not test this with anyone who has dark skin. Let's only make sure that it works for light-skinned people. So I don't know if you're cringing, but stuff like that makes me cringe a lot. And yeah, it's cringeworthy. This is hurtful shit, right? I think we need to ask ourselves, why does this technology not see everybody? And who's making it? And who are they making it for? So who gets to create the future? And more importantly, who doesn't? And if you are not participating in the creation of that future, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for your future? And what does that mean for people like you? So some of you might have heard this term before, dominant narratives. I'm going to be talking about this a lot. Dominant narratives are those that are told by the dominant culture. So in the case of the camera technology I was just talking about, the dominant narrative would be, this camera is amazing, and it detects people's faces, and it'll tell you everything that you need to know about how your photo is, sucks or whatever. And counter narratives are stories that are told, stories that contradict the dominant narrative. So the counter narrative in this case would be, no, your camera doesn't work. It's a piece of garbage. It doesn't work for us. So I'm going to be sharing both kinds of narratives with you today. And I want you to consider, like, are you participating in a dominant narrative? Are you participating in a counter narrative? Are you intentionally supporting a dominant narrative that you don't actually believe in, that doesn't align with your values? Look at her. So she's not playing this game, right? She's not enjoying herself. Like, she looks a little, I don't know, blank, or maybe even a little upset. But this is the dominant narrative that the video games industry has had for a long time about women. And that is that women only really exist in games to serve the desires of heterosexual boys and men. And according to this narrative, girls and women can be present in games as characters and as players, but only as long as they don't interfere with the desires of men. And this kind of world in which women exist only in the ways that men want them to has been really toxic. Like, we've been hearing recently about a lot of harassment and threats that have been leveled against women who speak up against, sexism and misogyny in video games. And it's really terrifying. And if you look at the numbers, that's not the right font, but that's okay. If you look at the numbers, women make up more than 50% of game players. Like, more than 50%. 11% of game designers, though, and only 3% of game programmers. So this led a bunch of us to start asking, if more women became producers of games and creators of games, and not just consumers, maybe gaming culture would change. So this was our counter-narrative. It was called the Difference Engine Initiative. Has anyone heard of the Difference Engine Initiative? Hand-Eye Society, Toronto? It's okay. Yes, one person. Amazing. But this was a 6-week game-making program in Toronto for women who wanted to make their first video games. So we learned about paper prototyping. We learned about wireframing. We learned some coding. We learned some animation. We learned a little bit of level design. And it was amazing. And it was really intended to be a counter-narrative, so women could imagine their own future in games. And so what did that counter-narrative look like? It looked like my game, which was called Unicorn Justice Fighter / Unicorn Robber Baron. And it involved all of my favorite things, such as unicorns pooping rainbows in space. And it was a political economy simulation, so my favorite. This is Space Victory by Marguerite Williams, and this is a 2.5D platformer, and it's about an explorer who crash lands on a beautiful planet, and she has to figure out how to escape before this planet totally engulfs her. And what I really love about this is, like, look at this character, right? Look at her small chest and her huge thighs. Like, you never see this in mainstream video games. And it was just such a wonderful response to me, to some of the like, this one dominant idea or image of a woman in a video game. And this is, oops. Oh, no. So this is The Immoral Misconduct by Hannah Epstein. And this is a game that turns YouTube annotations into a choose-your-own-adventure game. So you know those boxes that pop up that link you to other videos? So she had a box for yes and a box for no. So you find yourself, you're playing a woman in jail, and you find yourself in these yes-no situations, and you have to decide, like, do you flip off these guards or not? Yes or no? And so in order to advance the narrative, you choose an option, and the options lead to violence or comedy or both. So it took YouTube, which isn't really considered a gaming platform, and turned it into one. So this game got a ton of coverage in the games press, and since then, Hannah's made over a dozen titles, including The Karsmashians and Look at My Butt. So this is us, and this is only some of us, actually. There's about a dozen of us. And yeah, I really felt like the Difference Engine initiative was changing gaming culture. Like, we were making games that appealed to us. We were changing the very definition of games. We were building a strong community, and we were inspiring other women to make games. It was amazing. But that didn't mean that gaming culture was just going to let us kind of come in and disrupt their narrative, right? Yep. So these are some of the tweets that I got when I was speaking up about harassment in gaming and the need for initiatives like the Difference Engine. And these are actually pretty mild compared to a lot of the harassment and threats that other people have been enduring, other women have been enduring. There were also women who had been in games for a while and didn't feel like we deserved this kind of support, and we didn't feel like, you know, essentially a support group for women who wanted to make games was a good idea, that it would result in good games. And so this was a talk that happened at the Game Developers Conference in 2012. And it was specifically about the Difference Engine. And it characterized us as entitled and victims and people who just kind of wanted to complain about how hard it was for us in video games. That sucked. So I retaliated, and I retaliated in the only way that I knew how. I created an infographic. And this was, what was this? So this is called the Difference Engine Initiative, the Ripple Effect. And it mapped out every single game that we made. It mapped out every collaboration that we engaged in, every program that we founded afterwards, every exhibition, every gig, to really show that these kinds of programs are important and that they have an impact. So it was this map of a growing counter-narrative universe of women in games. And if you Google the Difference Engine Initiative now, this is an image that comes up in some of the first search results. So this became the defining narrative of the Difference Engine, but we had to fight for this. So now women in games initiatives are really common, I'm happy to say. All over the world, there's a whole bunch of different programs, not just for women, but for people who have been traditionally marginalized by games. And if I tried to create this infographic now, I created this by hand in Illustrator. So I mapped out each dot manually, and I connected them manually. But I wouldn't be able to create this now, because it's 2016. This was 4 years ago, and just the growth has been exponential. The women in this community have made thousands of games, and they've gone on to help other women make games as well. So with the help of my development partner, Dan Tolliver, and the support of Allied Media Projects in Detroit, we're creating a ripple mapping tool. So this is data visualization technology that allows people from marginalized communities to map out their impacts and show that what they're doing is working. And this is really helpful for when you need to refute the dominant narrative. So changing narratives is what my design studio and also too does. And we asked the question, what if the future was created with people who are traditionally marginalized by design and technology? And we call this collaborative design. I'm going to share a few examples and stories of how we've worked within communities to create counter-narratives. Has anyone heard the phrase breast is best before? Yeah? I'm not talking about video games anymore. So Breast is Best is a public health campaign that aims to tell women, to convince women to breastfeed rather than formula feed. And the claim is that your baby will be healthier, your baby will be stronger, your baby will be smarter, more charismatic, good looking, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been very successful because, I mean, breast is best, it rhymes. The acronym is BIB. It's pro-boob, right? You can't go wrong. And this is a UNICEF poster that supports that campaign. So in this narrative about the future, babies all over the world will be strong and healthy because of breast milk. So this is the dominant narrative. And again, we have to think about like who's left out of this story. A lot of women around the world can't or choose not to breastfeed. And one of those groups is women who are HIV positive because HIV can be transmitted through breast milk. So this is what comes up when you do a Google image search for infant feeding. So it's all kinds of different babies, diverse babies. They're being fed in diverse ways. Very lovely. And this is what comes up when you do a Google image search for HIV and infant feeding. So the babies, if you notice, they all have the same skin color. It's dark. It's a lot more clinical. It's a lot more informational. And it's even a little bit anxiety-inducing. So this is the dominant narrative at work, right? It associates HIV with dark skin tones. And it associates being pregnant when you're HIV positive with a time to be anxious and to worry. And it's not a time of joy for you. So we were asked by the Canadian AIDS Treatment and Information Exchange, CAIDI, to design a resource that would help HIV-positive women feel more comfortable about breastfeeding and feel more informed and equipped about it. And the first thing that we did was we sat down with these moms and we looked at the kinds of resources that they were already seeing. And the conversation was very similar to, or the things that came up were very similar to what I just discussed with that Google image search. They found that the skin tones that were depicted were very dark. They found that the resources were very clinical. All of them said HIV on the cover. So it was impossible to separate being HIV positive from feeding your infant. So what do we do with the dominant narrative? We cut it up. So we like to, hey, go back. So we like to use collage. We think it's a really powerful collaborative design tool. It allows people to take images from a dominant narrative, cut them up, slice and dice them, and remix them into a new counter-narrative that better reflects their experiences and their desires. And our counter-narrative here was, no, breast isn't always best. So here is what the moms made. So we noticed that they were cutting the babies away from their parents. So there was a mom holding a baby, but they would cut the baby out. And when asked about why they did that, they said it's not about the mom, it's about the baby. So if you keep it about the mom, if you keep the focus on the mom holding the baby, then it's about HIV. And we see HIV resources all the time. That's all we see, that's all we get. And for just a moment, I would like a resource to focus on my baby. So they wanted it to focus on the baby's health. They chose photos of these active, healthy, chubby babies, and that's what they wanted to see. And they wanted to share the message with other HIV-positive moms that you can raise a healthy baby on formula. And so they also tried rewriting the title. The initial title, the working title, was Infant Feeding When You're HIV Positive. Do you have all the facts? So again, it's very blamey. It's asking the moms, it's asking them whether they're equipped to have a baby. So it was stigmatizing. And this collage was titled, "Is Formula Good for My Baby?" And as soon as the moms saw that, the other moms, they were like, yes, this is what we want to call the resource. Is formula good for my baby? That's all we need to know. We know we have HIV. That's all we need to know. So we took the collages back to the studio, and this is what we created. It's a pocket-sized book. It's called Is Formula Good for My Baby? It doesn't say HIV anywhere on the front, so they can comfortably read it on the subway. They can read it while waiting for the bus. If it falls out of your bag, they don't have to worry about having their status disclosed unintentionally and involuntarily. And there's these active, squirming, healthy babies, like babies do, right? They kind of squirm away. They squirm out of your sight, and that's what we wanted. That's what we wanted to depict. We wanted to show them interacting with other babies, so it wouldn't be like your child is alone. We found that a lot of the resources just showed one baby all isolated by itself. So they're not alone or different in any way. And we did want to show a diversity, but we didn't want to, have very literal kinds of skin tones. So we rendered most of the babies in red, which is not a realistic skin color. And let's go back. So we rendered them in red and kind of gave them this uniformity. So even though they were all different babies, they were all the same. Those are the reasons for formula feeding. If somebody kind of comes at you and asks you, why are you formula feeding? There are some different reasons you can give people that don't disclose your status. So the dominant narrative was breast is best, and our counter narrative was no, sometimes that's not what's best for the baby, and we shouldn't feel ashamed of formula feeding. So the resource has been really well received. And the women who took part in this collaborative design workshop are really proud of what they've done. And this isn't something that I could have done by myself in my studio, right? I needed to talk with them. I needed to eat with them. I needed to, ask them to collage their counter narratives for me. So migrant worker programs, there's a lot of them around the world. And the dominant narrative about them is that they're a bountiful source of cheap labor. They're a great opportunity for people from poorer countries to come to developed countries and work and make money and send it home. In reality, migrant worker programs leave workers unprotected from abuse and exploitation because they're here under these special visa programs, and they don't have the same rights that residents and citizens do. And this hits home hard because here in the London area, a worker named Robert Self filed a discrimination suit. He's from Jamaica. He cut his neck open while working on a tobacco farm. And he received, I think, 3 months of health care, and then after that he was kind of told, okay, you're on your own. Whereas a Canadian worker would have received care for the rest of their lives. But because he was here on a visa, working on a farm in Canada on Canadian soil for the Canadian economy, and he wasn't Canadian, he's kind of just sent on his way. So Centro de los Derechos del Migrante is a migrant workers' rights organization, and they've been working within communities in Mexico to educate workers about their rights and advocate on behalf of them when their rights are violated. And CDM noticed a Facebook page run by a fraudulent recruitment agency. And the people who ran the page had since abandoned it, but other people had taken it over, the comment section, and they were kind of posting these reviews of fraudulent recruiters, not just this one, but other ones. So it became this kind of community bulletin board that people came to find information about which employers you should avoid and which recruiters you should avoid. There's some good ones out there, but there's also some really problematic ones. So CDM approached us to rip off Yelp, essentially, because they wanted to have this kind of Facebook bulletin board style thing, but do it on a bigger scale. So to do this, we engaged in a cross-border collaboration with Mexican migrant workers. And we learned a lot of things. we learned that when they're on the job, workers access the internet by cycling like 20 miles to the nearest library. And libraries in rural areas aren't always equipped with like fancy computers and high-speed internet access. So that was a consideration. We did learn that they have cell phones and they texted quite a bit. So they had access to SMS technology and cell phone technology was a lot better than access to internet. We also learned that print and radio were important media. And the last thing that we learned was that they were really concerned that if they used a medium like this to kind of review bad employers, abusive employers, that there would be reprisals against them, that there would be violence against their families or against themselves. And that's because a lot of these recruiters are connected to the cartel. So the fear of violence was really real. So at each stage of the design and development process, we looped back to the workers. We showed them our logo designs, our wireframes. We showed them our prototype. We talked a lot, and there was a lot of translation. Some of the people on our team were Spanish speaking. I'm not, so I just appreciated the efforts of people who translated the feedback for me. And it was really discouraging at first because I don't think any of these workers had encountered something like Yelp before, so it was a lot of work just to get them up to speed on how to use the website and why they could use it and why we would make it safe for them to use it. So this is our counter-narrative. It's called contratados.org, and it's been billed as a Yelp for migrant workers. So you can log on, you can choose to search for a recruiter or an employer, you can write a review, you can learn about your rights, or you can read the latest notices. So we made sure to make this really lightweight. We made sure that it would work on computers that these workers were accessing it on. This is what the search looks like. So it's a lot like Yelp. There's filters. It's location-based. You can write reviews. You can write very brief ones. And you can write very long ones. Clicking. Okay. So I don't know if you noticed, but both of those reviews had just like silhouette avatars. They didn't have actual photos. And so we took the privacy thing really seriously. We're not trying to collect information about our users. We're trying to get our users to share information with each other. So we're not actually Yelp. We're not trying to sell the information about our users. And we want to protect them. We don't want them to have to fear using this website. So this is a profile page of a recruitment agency. And you can see here that when you write a review, you're asked some questions. And unfortunately, this recruitment agency, some of the workers experienced abuse, physical, verbal, and sexual. And because print and radio were important media, we made sure to create Know Your Rights materials. So this is a mini graphic novel. We created radio PSAs that ran on Mexican public radio stations. And we also knew that people might not be able to make it all the way to a computer to write a review, so we made sure that people were able to call in their reviews as well. So this is a photo from a training of over 100 workers in Zacatecas. And for those of you who are building community online, this is a really reverse scenario because we built the community first in the physical world, and then we've been working to make sure that people in the virtual world will use the site. So Contratados has over 4,200 subscribers and users and over 500,000 page views. And these are kind of older statistics, so I'm sure it's more than that now. And we have received quite a few awards and some great press. This is from the Christian Science Monitor, and it labels Contratados as one of 3 tech tools that are actually working to free modern slaves. But the most amazing thing for me is that these migrant workers, through the collaborative design process, and through writing these reviews are one at a time rewriting their futures by holding employers and recruiters accountable. So Duncan Campbell Scott, who was Canada's head of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, was quoted as saying, "The happiest future for the Indian race is absorption into the general population, and this is the object and policy of our government." This is the future of Canada's past, and this was the rationale for residential schools. So residential schools, as I'm sure most of you know, or a lot of you know, are when young people were pulled out of their homes and segregated in these schools and kind of like reprogrammed to have Western values, to have Christian values, and were told that their culture was backwards, was savage, was evil, etc. And so one of the outcomes of this was what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls cultural genocide, which is the systematic destruction of traditions, values, language, and other elements that make one group distinct from another group. And as we know, Indigenous people, and especially Indigenous youth, they didn't imagine that future for themselves. That future was, it was foisted upon them. They were on the receiving end of it. So in 2012, about 100 young people from First Nations communities across Ontario gathered in Thunder Bay for the Feathers of Hope Youth Forum. And they wanted to talk about the kind of change that they wanted to see, because they wanted to be able to imagine their futures. And one issue that kept coming back again and again was this lack of connection to culture. So Canada's policy, from Duncan Campbell Scott before him and after him, those have actually been really, unfortunately, successful. These young people didn't feel like they knew their culture. So they spent a lot of the time in the forum talking to each other and meeting people from other First Nations communities and learning that their struggles were very similar. And at the end of the forum, they presented their findings to police, to government ministers, to service providers. And they talked about all the kinds of issues that they're experiencing. Poverty, lack of opportunity, struggling with suicide and depression, lack of access to education, equal education, lack of access to the kind of education that we have here in the southern part of the country. So the outcome of this forum was intended to be a report to law and policymakers to tell them about what First Nations youth wanted, the kind of change that they wanted to see. And it was my job to give that some shape, to design a report, and to elevate their voices, so to give them something that reflected their hopes and dreams. And it was called Feathers of Hope, and I really had to think about how to communicate the sense of optimism and empowerment that they had leaving the forum. They were just able to talk to people who were making decisions about their lives. They'd never had this kind of power before. But at the same time, they were talking about a lot of really desperate issues. So how to capture that sense of hope and despair at the same time. And as a designer, I just go through the process, right? You go through the steps. You create a brief. You do some research. You do some creative. We all know how this goes. So this was one of the first set of concepts that I presented to the youth amplifiers. And we ended up going with something like the one on the right at first. So I kept working on it, and I tried different renditions of it, and it just wasn't working. One of the amplifiers was like, that looks like a bug. It's not bugs of hope. This is feathers of hope. I was like, damn it. And another one said, it's not alive, and it needs to be alive. So the design brief was really failing me. It had never failed me before. I always go through the steps. I always come up with some kind of solution. And it was really getting to me. So after one really disastrous meeting, the team gave me this medicine bundle that they had made. They gave me this medicine bundle. And the medicines that were contained within it were sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and tobacco. And these are 4 really important medicines. And they said, use this. We know it will help. And they sent me on my way. I had no idea what I was doing. I don't know how to use medicines. I'm not spiritual. So I didn't know what to do, so I just Googled it. And I learned that different medicines have different purposes, and you light them on fire, and they kind of smolder, and they create this smoke. And you waft it over yourself, and that's called a smudge. I don't know if you know about this, but I didn't know about it at the time. So this here is sage, and it's a purifying medicine. But I lit them all up at the same time, and I just inhaled a whole bunch of smoke. And I didn't know what I was doing at all. And then I started feeling really lightheaded, so I went to lie down. And I opened up my iPad thinking I'd watch some Netflix, and this is what popped up. I guess I'd been browsing some art blogs earlier, but this is a piece called Vanishing Point by United Visual Artists, and it uses lasers to play with perspective. But in this state of mind with my head filled with smoke, feeling lightheaded, I was like, this is it. This is what I need to do. And I scribbled this down. It's a feather. I imagine this feather made of light coming out of darkness and shrouded in the protective, in a protective layer of sage smudge. So I cut this feather out of black paper. And I prepared a sage smudge. I backlit it. And I photographed it. So this is the cover of the Feathers of Hope Youth Action Plan for Change. And when I first showed it to them, after months of these kinds of meetings and presentations and trying and making bugs of hope, people literally burst into tears because it was just such a relief that we finally had something. But also because there was this real sense that it was communicating something that they hadn't been able to communicate yet, that we hadn't been able to communicate yet. So it was clear that this was going to be more than just a cover of a report. It was going to be an emblem of a movement. So there's the sage. And what this made me realize was that all along, this wasn't a design problem to be solved in the way that designers solve problems using design thinking or whatever. The key to this was really in the culture. And until I participated in that, and until I had some insight into that, until I got that inspiration from the somewhere else that the smoke filled my head with, I wasn't going to get anywhere. And I really needed to engage in the cultural piece and not just the political piece. I'm really used to the political piece, but the cultural piece not so much. But as we saw with Duncan Campbell Scott, the politics, the policies were really about eliminating and eradicating the culture. So in order to do this, I needed to engage with culture. And I realized that my design education was all about selling products and persuasion. And so I really needed to step away from design in order to create this design. So I've lost count of how many copies of Feathers of Hope have been printed and how many reprints we've done. But I think there's tens, oh no. What is that? Okay, sorry about that. So I think there's tens of thousands of these books floating around Ontario. And this is a really proud moment for me. In 2014, in March, the report was placed in the Bentwood box at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it's going to be archived as part of the proceedings. And Feathers of Hope is now much more than a report. It's a province-wide youth movement. And young people have really adopted the feather as their own. This is not my symbol anymore. It's not a thing that I created. It's a thing that is theirs. And this is Talon. He's really made it his own. I don't normally condone people getting my work tattooed on their bodies. But this isn't my work. This is our work. We created this together. Talon was the one that told me that my feather looked like a bug. So this was a moment that I'll never forget, knowing what we'd done to get to this point. So Feathers of Hope has had 2 forums since then, one on justice and juries, and one on the child welfare system. And we're going to have another one in July on culture and identity. And I'm also really proud to say that we've partnered with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we're going to be taking Feathers of Hope from a provincial Ontario thing. We're taking it nationwide. We're going to do forums all over the country over many years, and we're going to make sure that, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has started a dialogue with elders and with the Canadian public, we're going to do that with young people. So this is Carla, Sam. This is Carla, Sam, Ryan, Talon, Savannah, and Uko. And they're rewriting the future of First Nations youth. So each decision that we make as creative professionals shapes the future. And I want to ask you to think about whose future you're creating. And how does that narrative imagine the future of women in games, of HIV-positive mothers, of migrant workers, and of Indigenous youth? I know you all have so much to think about already, but I'm asking you to think about this as well, because this is important, and this is what really matters. So how do we do that? We have to minimize harm, because let's face it, every new thing that we create has some kind of detrimental impact on the planet, and maybe the people as well. And I talked about how creative professionals solve problems. And I want you to think, when you're solving problems for your clients or your investors, are you creating more problems for other people, people with a lot less power? And let's think about the design brief. You know how there's only like 2 people that are represented on that? There's the client, and then there's the audience, or the users. What about everybody else? So let's think about who will be impacted and how. So what communities are depicted and represented in the future that you're creating? Are they there at all? Or are they only there to represent something negative? And whose labor is being used to deliver the products and the services? And is everyone in the chain of production treated justly and fairly? Or is there exploitation happening? Are you relying on stereotypes to market your product? Are you relying on cultural appropriation? So let's not forget the young people of Feathers of Hope who are trying so hard to rediscover their culture and to reconnect with it. So knowing that history, it's really hard to justify offensive parodies like this. So let's maximize benefit. Contratados.org couldn't have been built without using open source software. We couldn't have done it from the ground up. So share and share alike, please. And I want you to look around and ask, what does your team look like? Are you the dominant narrative club? Why is that? What kind of impact do you think that's going to have? So support diversity. And if you can't do it through hiring, please do it through mentorship. And if you are interested in social impact work, and I hope that you are, I hope that you'll do these kinds of projects as well, because there's so much work to be done. But I'd ask that you create with us. Don't create for us. Don't impose your solutions, because that always has a legacy that's hard to predict, but it's always bad. So I'm here to say that another world is happening, and a counter-narrative is being written, that an alternative future is being created by people who have historically been marginalized and had their futures imagined for them. So I'm asking you as future makers to consider us and to support us and to think about the ways that you can minimize harm and maximize benefit. And I'm so happy to be saying this in London, because we're here at a time when this city is defining its future, and it's not being written yet. So you don't have to be like Toronto. You don't have to be like New York or San Francisco. Please don't be like San Francisco. Thank you.
We're open for questions. If you guys want to ask Una any questions. Come on, there's always good. We'll give everybody a moment. It always takes a pause.
Okay. Pause it. Also, I don't bite, so you can, oh.
There you go. Stand up. Hi.
Hello.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, first of all. I thought the collaborative exercises that you did, like with having people actually make the pictures of like the babies like cutouts and stuff like that. I was wondering how you went about getting that, like organizing that and making it happen.
Sure. So the question, for those of you who couldn't hear it, was how did we organize and make the collaborative design workshop happen with the HIV-positive moms? So whenever a client approaches me, I try to convince them or trick them into doing a collaborative design process. So Katie already had this connection to a group that was meeting already. It was called a New Moms Group, and it was meeting at the Teresa group, which is in Toronto. It's for families with, living with HIV/AIDS. So they already had this group meeting, and I was like, cool, can I come, and can we cut some stuff out and talk? But it's not always the case that that can happen. But I really tried to work with clients that are open to that. Because there's a lot of people in nonprofits who are experts, and they might be academically experts, but they might not have the kind of life experience. Thank you.
Yes.
I come from the game design and development background, so the first slide was actually more interesting for me. What can males be doing to help females develop into the game design development programming? Because if those statistics are as you presented, I can't, especially as an indie level developer, be contributing to that without bringing in people that don't seem to be interested, but there's definitely movement for them. So what can I be doing to help them?
Thank you. So the question was, what can men be doing to support women in games to be combating the dominant narrative? And there's so much, right? So many things. Mentorship. I don't know if London has like games community like organization, but if there is, there's ways to organize one-on-one mentorships or group mentorships. You can call out shit that you see, right? Like, there's just so much toxicity, and it doesn't always come in the form of really blatant comments. Like, sometimes it's microaggressions. So call that out. And support the things that women are saying. Like, don't leave us to, be shouting into the void. So retweets, post articles, try not to mansplain things. Yeah. Yes.
I am from memory, and I see that the IT community or design community are very diverse. I would encourage employers to hire diverse teams.
So how would I encourage employers to hire diverse teams? I always ask, like, where are you looking? Who are your networks? Are you only talking to people who look like you? And why is that? So get outside of your networks, talk to people, and people know people. So even if you're talking to somebody who you might not necessarily be interested in hiring at that point, they probably know other people. So that's, yeah. But if you guys have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear that as well. Yes?
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you think the fact that you work with clientele that are politically focused or social justice focused, do you think you make less money in your job because you work with those types of folks versus kind of traditional corporate clientele?
Yeah. So the question was, am I not rich because of the work that I do? And the question is, and the answer is, I could be richer, for sure. But I'm so fucking happy, right?
Right.
I love this work, and it's just, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. I'm lucky, People are like, that's great that you do that work. You don't make a lot of money, whatever, but it's a privilege to do this work, for sure, and I recognize that. Yeah.
When you were starting out, did you find there was like a network of people like you, or like did you start it all with you? Or?
I did, yeah. There weren't so many people, and there's still, I don't have a lot of mentors, so that's why I stress mentorship so much, and that's why I offer mentorship so much. But not a lot of people. But there are more now, so that's very encouraging. And there's a question back there.
Yeah, I'm not a designer, but I know a lot of designers. people in the creative industries. And everybody seems really passionate about this type of like social justice. Everybody I meet has a big heart for it, but that doesn't necessarily, you know, they have other deadlines in their job, and they have other projects they have to accomplish. They can't necessarily open up their own design studio devoted to social justice solving problems. So I just wondered if you have any tips, or if you've met people who've been able to bring that into the workplace in any way. If you have any tips that way.
So do I have any tips on bringing kind of like social justice or more equitable values into the workplace? And for sure, so hiring is one of them. Mentorship, another one, always. I don't know, I guess it's different at the management level. So if you're a manager, you have a lot of power and you can do things to encourage that. But if you're not, then I'd say like just support the people who you see that are going through a hard time, that are experiencing injustice, that might be experiencing things that other people aren't experiencing because of where they're socially located. So whether that's the color of their skin or the gender or sexuality. My team is 3 people strong. So it's myself and another designer and a studio coordinator. But I work with this giant network of people. So those projects that you saw were not done alone, for sure. Yeah, so we have just like tentacles all over the place, and they're growing.
Do you use goodwork.ca or anything like that?
Goodwork.ca, I think that I've been on it, but most of the work comes through word of mouth and through networks. So thank you for your questions, and thank you so much.